Hello everybody and welcome to episode 2 of the Crash F1 podcast for the 2025 season. I am joined again by Lewis and Connor from the Crash editorial team. It's been a busy week in F1 news as we tick off another step towards pre-season and the first race in Australia. We've seen the first images and videos of Lewis Hamilton at the Ferrari factory and their test track in Fiorano. Lewis, what did you make of his first week in red?
Yeah, I'm trying to think to a time that's been sort of more hyped up in F1, and there's been so much excitement around that week, and I'm sort of struggling to think of other examples. It's certainly been the sort of most exciting week of the year we've had so far, with all the sort of hype and build up around it. And I think it was such a hyped event for his first appearance. We've been talking about it for weeks, and then it's finally happened. We finally got those first images of him at the factory and seeing him starting to embed himself with the team. And then, of course, his first day in the car at Fiorano on Wednesday, and we finally got to see pictures of him in his Ferrari overalls and in the car and with his helmet, and just seeing, sort of starting to get used to how that actually looks, because it's quite a shock after getting used to seeing him in black in later years, the silver of Mercedes and McLaren prior to that. So yeah, it's kind of getting our heads around that and adjusting to that. But that's been the dominating story of the past week or so. And yeah, just to see how he fits in at Ferrari. It's hard to glean too much from the test itself. It's obviously done in an older car and there's restricted mileage. The conditions on the day weren't great either. It was damp, it was cold. It was far from, to get any sort of representative, meaningful data from it is quite difficult. It was more about giving Hamilton that opportunity to bed in, get to the team, get used to the people he's working with, understanding Ferrari's working practices more so and getting a first feel for the car. But I think one of the biggest things for me to take away from what we saw on Wednesday was just how, and from last week in general, was just how genuinely happy Hamilton looked. And he looks focused and re-energized. It does look like this move has given him that lift that he perhaps needed.
Yeah, similar thoughts on my end. I think it's been a surreal week, really. So I think it's combining the 7-time world champion with Ferrari. I think a lot's been made of it, but to actually see Hamilton in drive Ferrari for the first time, to see him wear those red overalls, I just think it really has, the hype has been maybe bigger than I've even expected myself. So I think it sticks off a lot of boxes. I think it's just good for the sport as a whole. I think without the move, I think the drive market would have been stellar overall, but I think it just gives us something extra to talk about as well. So I think I'm just excited to see Hamilton really get back on track in a competitive sense, to see if he's really back or if it's going to be another difficult season. So yeah, it's an incredible week. I think all eyes on F1, not just F1 fans, but the whole sporting world. So credit to Ferrari for the social post has been doing, and just the hype around it's just been incredible.
Yeah, for sure. I think that, I was looking through the numbers, and I think we even did a post about it on our Instagram, but it was the shot of him outside the factory in his long coat and his F40, I think, is the single most engaged piece of F1 media on social media now. It broke the record of Ferrari's own post of Charles winning Monza last year, and it's you're absolutely right that there's been this kind of massive boom across the international sporting world. You don't really have to be that into F1 to understand the significance of F1's most famous driver joining F1's most famous team. It's quite easy to put that together. And Lewis, you mentioned too, and we touched on it in the last episode as well, but that smile was back for Lewis. So he'd come and was, everything, all that hype that he must have been feeling himself, to see that materialize in fans trying to climb over the barrier and all the international media circling as close as they could get to the track. And then, of course, Ferrari's own media milking it as much as they can. And there's been some brilliant kind of symbolism. I mean, their comms department has got an absolute goldmine this year. You talked about, too, the kind of lap times not really being any tangible thing to gain from it. I suppose, Lewis, I'm interested to know what you think Hamilton will be looking for then throughout this kind of bedding in process as we head towards Australia. What is that process going to be like for him? The kind of steps to get comfortable within that team?
I think mainly it's to get to know the working process of Ferrari. It's a completely different team and culture to what he's been used to. And obviously he was driving for Mercedes for the last 12 years. That's a long period of time to kind of know the inner workings out of how a team works. It would almost have been second nature to him at a certain point where he didn't really have to think about it too much. Whereas that's completely changed now at Ferrari, and he's got to get used to that and the people that he's working with. One of the biggest relationships is obviously working with his new race engineer, Riccardo Adami, who obviously Hamilton had that long-standing famous relationship with Bono at Mercedes, and he's now got to try and figure out a similar sort of rapport with his new race engineer. From what we've heard, it sounds like there were positive early signs with the interactions between the pair in those first few days. But really, it's those kind of elements that are key to just getting used to the people that he's working with, and also getting a feel for the car. Okay, the car itself is obviously going to be different to what he eventually drives this season. He's been driving the 2023 car, but still just getting the feel of how the Ferrari is set up. We've seen reports in Italy that he was having some issues with the pedals and the steering wheel and was asking for adaptations there, which Ferrari have reportedly already got on top of and have brought in changes for his upcoming test. We know he's doing further testing this week in Barcelona, again part of the TPC testing program. Don't know whether it will be in the 2023 car, it could be in the 2022 car, but it's again just about getting that seat time, getting comfortable with his positioning, with the pedals, with the way the cockpit works, getting used to the steering wheel. He was apparently using the same steering wheel as Charles Leclerc in last week, but with a view to making modifications that suit him in the future. So it's all these kind of intricate details that can easily be overlooked when we don't necessarily think about all the finer details when we're watching and covering the sport. But it's all these important things that will make a difference. And there's so little time between now and the start of the season to get up to speed that any sort of testing, regardless of whether it's in an old car or not, is all hugely helpful. And then obviously when he'll get a feel for the 2025 car. They'll do an initial shakedown run as they usually do on the day that it's launched. But then other than that, he'll have effectively 1.5 days, because they'll be sharing the running over the 3 days in Bahrain to get used to the new car before the season starts. So yeah, it's just really like bedding in and learning all of the processes and getting an initial feel for and comfort for the car.
Yeah, it's fair to say that Lewis is actually quite far behind in terms of his preparation, because he missed the end of the season test in Abu Dhabi, which Carlos Sainz got the opportunity to drive for Williams. So this mileage, even though it's not a lot, is so crucial for Hamilton to get up to speed, learn the steering wheel, and as Lewis mentioned, build those relationships, because there just isn't a lot of time for Hamilton to get up to speed. And yes, he is statistically the GOAT, but he does need track time, and every lap, every moment with the team is going to make a big difference, especially because he is behind the likes of Ocon and Sainz, who have had a lot of opportunities to drive for their new team last year.
And I remember when he moved to Mercedes, when he made that switch from McLaren, it took him a while to get up to speed there. Probably, I think it took him around about half a season before he was sort of regularly on pace with Rosberg, and it took him half the season to win his first race for Mercedes. So I don't think we should underestimate the challenge of that bedding in process. And, Charles has been at Ferrari now for years, and it's effectively become his team. So he knows all the inner workings out. He's got everything he is comfortable there now, and he knows what to expect. And Hamilton's got a lot of playing catch up to do. So it would be a big challenge for him, no doubt.
Yeah, for sure. I think a lot of we spoke to about the first media coming out. We got pictures, we got videos, and we got a quote from Lewis too, where he mentioned that driving a Ferrari for the first time reminded him of just driving a Formula One car for the first time. And in kind of context of that, I'm reminded of the hype that Lewis had when he was coming into Formula One in the first place, as like being this talent that McLaren had taken their time developing. They'd given him significant time. They hadn't rushed him through the categories. And then he came in, very, very quick from the off, ended up, as everyone knows, 1 point off the championship in his rookie year, which is not ever something we've seen really replicated since, and unlikely to ever will be. We've spoken about Lewis's kind of personal development, him staying in with the team, his steering wheel, the engineers, all those sorts of things. As we approach car launch season, it feels like we're also getting very positive rumblings of just Ferrari's technical package in isolation, that of course will be shared between both Charles and Lewis. There's a lot of attitude. I even remember towards the end of last year where Ferrari were getting right up to the back of the McLarens, if not faster, in some races, and people were saying, tough must this be for Sainz. He'll know what's coming next year in the development package, and he knows that he won't have access to that. Are you guys kind of estimating that Ferrari's technical package will be right there, and the fact that they've got Sarah coming in as he came in 2023 as their principal chassis engineer. They've had time now throughout this kind of technical era to develop their powertrain. Every sign is pointing in the right direction, right? What do you think on that, Connor?
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to Ferrari in the off-season, I feel like there's always reports in the Italian media, we found half a second, found so much horsepower. So I think there's reason to be optimistic, especially if you look at last year. I think I touched on it in the last episode. They fixed their issues in the middle of the season in terms of their Barcelona upgrade, which brought the porpoising back. They fixed that with, I think it was a Monza upgrade. So I think from Monza onwards, it was McLaren versus Ferrari a lot of the time. So I think Ferrari, probably for the first time, I feel like in maybe decades, that their in-season development appears to be on track. So I think that gives them a lot of confidence. So I think it's just transferring that into next season, this coming season. I think one key area they do need to improve is qualifying, which is in fact probably Lewis Hamilton's weakness from last year. I think in terms of getting the tyres up to temperature and really extracting the most over a lap is one of their weaknesses. And Leclerc is probably the best in qualifying on the grid, but last year I wouldn't say it was probably his standout year, and I wouldn't say that's his fault. So I think that's the main concern, and probably how they perform in high-speed corners, because I think McLaren and Red Bull were quite so ahead in those high-speed corners as well. So I think the signs are looking good for Ferrari, but you've got to be cautious, because over the winter, if you take a wrong step, porpoising could return. You just don't know what's going to happen over the winter. But overall, I think there are positive signs.
It's very easy to fall into that, off-season winter hype with Ferrari, and we always hear these murmurings coming from Italy, as Connor said. But there is reason to be hopeful and optimistic. I mean, how they ended last season competitively, there's no reason why they can't be in that. It's going to be such a tight season again, particularly at the start. There's going to be at least 3-4 teams in the fight, and Ferrari are going to be one of those. I thought one interesting thing that we heard from Fred Vasseur's pre-Christmas lunch media event that Ferrari hold annually was that he said 99% of the car would actually change for this year, and I thought that's quite interesting given how competitive they ended last year. That feels like a little bit of a risk potentially, but perhaps it's a bold move, because the more you change, perhaps there is then the scope to make bigger gains. But given that they obviously ended last season in such a strong position, that seems like quite a bold strategic choice to make, particularly when we're getting to a point now where obviously the focus is largely going to be on 2026 and the new regulations, now that teams can start working on those cars as of the 1st of January this year. So a lot of teams will be shifting their focus to 2026. It's interesting that Ferrari have still going sort of full kilter with at least this car from the start of the season, in the bid to sort of make sure they're in that position to be even more competitive than they ended last season. But yeah, I don't see a reason why they can't be right up there from the start, sort of following on from the end of last season.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm reminded too, kind of when we're in this vein of developing a driver, getting ready for a season, and we think about all the tools that a team has kind of at their service to prepare a driver. Throughout 2022, Ollie Behrman was this kind of main talent for Ferrari that they were trying to develop, with testing at Fiorano and simulator time too. And I think his substitute drive for Sainz was a really interesting case study of just how well Ferrari are doing in that process, because we saw him come in and be, right on the, I mean, not obviously right on the pace, but finish in the top 10, avoid crashes at one of F1's, fastest, hardest circuits. So I was really impressed by that. But, as I said, the simulator was kind of a key part of that. But we do know, too, that simulation stuff isn't really something that Lewis Hamilton is a particularly big fan of. Do you think he'll have to change his attitude to that to kind of maximise the preparation?
I think he probably has, to a certain extent. The way that, from what we've seen early on, how he's embedded into Ferrari already, and this goes across the board, not just in terms of simulation, but just how much effort he's making from his side, that he is fully wanting this and wanting to make it a success. And just from the glimmers that we've seen of even the smaller things, like the concerted effort he's made to start learning Italian, for example, it's only basic Italian at the moment, more Italian than I know anyway. But just to help forging those connections with people in the team. And I think that just underlines how committed he is to this and how much he wants this to work. So he's been in the simulator and that process is already underway. And that will be crucial to how he goes at Ferrari and how they can develop the car that suits him and helps him find his feet at Ferrari. The difference is, as I touched on earlier, a Mercedes he was super comfortable. He knew everything and he perhaps didn't need that extra time, whereas this is a completely different ball game and he does sort of need to start from scratch. But yeah, just with like that effort of learning Italian and stuff. And I find it interesting as well, the sort of bond he's already created with the Tifosi as well, coming in, like they absolutely adore him already. As we saw, I think there was around 1,500 fans that were lined the perimeter fences for his first test, which I think is more than we saw when Alonso or even Vettel made their debuts, and they were equally hyped. So I think he's already got that sort of, even when he was winning for another team and beating Ferrari at times, the Tifosi was starting to warm to him, and now they seem to absolutely adore him. So he's already forged that connection, and he just seems to be really embedding himself in that sense in terms of making those connections with the Tifosi, but also arguably more importantly, obviously, within the team itself. And I think as a result of that, he's just fully committed to this project, and he will do absolutely. I don't think there's ever been. Hamilton has always sort of said he hates testing. He hates, post-season testing. He's never been a fan of it. He always tries to get out of at Mercedes. I don't think there's ever been a question mark over his commitment in terms of driving a team forward and getting the best out of a team and himself. And he knows himself that he's got areas to improve on, as we've mentioned with qualifying. And he'll be doing. I do believe he'll be fully rejuvenated and motivated to make those gains, and he's going to apply himself. I don't think there's ever been a question mark over that side of things.
Yeah, I think other than last year, maybe during his time at Mercedes, he was always the one pushing the setups. He was even at the simulator a lot. He was actually trying to turn Mercedes around. So I think he's a sort of driver, especially with this added motivation in a new team. He's not going to give up. He is going to be fully committed to the cause. So I don't think there could be any major concerns about Hamilton's, let's say, contribution in that regard. Obviously, when the season starts, it will come down to whether he is able to perform more than anything.
Just to follow up on that, obviously, there were times last season that we saw maybe Hamilton sort of dipped out a little bit. But I do think partly there was an element there of him just checking out anyway. He knew that, from early on, he knew Mercedes weren't in a position to really win races, certainly not challenge for the championships. He knew he was already leaving the team, as we sort of touched on with that sort of strange dynamic of the move being announced before he left. So I do think there was an element of Hamilton sort of easing off a little bit, whether it was subconsciously or not. But I think that was definitely a factor in terms of him sort of checking out a little bit and knowing what was to come and sort of re-engaging for this project. I think, that probably played a little role there as well. But I think now going to this season, he's going to be completely on it. And I do think it's going to be more of a question of how he performs and how quickly he gets up to speed. I don't think there are doubts that Ferrari will be there or thereabouts at the start of the season. I think it's more a question of how long it takes Hamilton to get up to speed, whether he can address those qualifying weaknesses that we've seen in the last year or so, particularly last season. I think that's more of a question, how quickly Hamilton can get up to speed, rather than will Ferrari be there, because I think they will be there or thereabouts.
For sure. And I suppose we heard throughout last week, Martin Brundle was on Sky kind of News giving his takes on exactly what we're talking about right now. And one of the things that I think people were a little bit surprised by, although it's a reasonably rational comment, was that he thought with kind of Lewis's aging in the sport, there has been whatever a 1%, 2%, 3% natural loss of just tiny things like reaction times, hand-eye coordination, little things like that are just going to naturally deteriorate, I suppose, unless your name is Fernando Alonso. But Brundle kind of made that point, then added the context of a 98% and 99% Lewis Hamilton in a fast enough car is still fast enough to win the title. Do you agree with that, Lewis?
I think so. I think there's also, like, Hamilton's season last season was poor by his standards, but it was still better than a lot of drivers on the grid, or or that would be their sort of peak in terms of getting those sort of results and that sort of finishing the championship. And I do agree that it's hard to say definitively whether or not Hamilton is on the downward sort of slope and has already reached his peak. I think we've seen signs that suggest that maybe there are areas where he's potentially lost an edge. But I do think, and I remember talking about this on the last episode, that I do think this season will be a fairer reflection of that, because we'll see whether it was the Mercedes itself, particularly last year's Mercedes, or whether it is Hamilton. We'll get once he's got up to speed at Ferrari, we'll probably start to get a fairer picture there alongside a different teammate. But to answer your question of do I think a 97, 98 or 99% Lewis Hamilton is still good enough to win a world championship, I think he is. But obviously, if he's going up against Max Verstappen, who's operating at 100%, and this is with the assumption that if Red Bull have ironed out their car issues, and if they have a very competitive car, then it will be incredibly difficult for anyone to beat Max Verstappen this season, is my opinion. But I do think that Hamilton, even at 99 or 98%, is probably the driver who can take it to Verstappen over the course of a season. I still think there are question marks on some of the others, like Lando Norris, for example. Last season was his most successful, strongest F1 season yet, but there were still those errors coming in and still question marks over his mentality and those kind of things that we didn't get to see Lando Norris versus Max Verstappen over the course of the season. The only driver we've really had that gauge with is Hamilton in 2021. And we know how that ended, but over the course of the season, they were pretty much like for like. As we went into we went into Abu Dhabi level on points, which pretty much summed everything up. Yeah, I think a Hamilton operating at 98, 99% is still going to be in contention for the championship. Whether he wins it or not is another matter, but he'll definitely be in contention, even if he's missing that little bit, I think.
Yeah, I think like a lot of drivers behind Verstappen, I think they've all got some glaring flaws. I think Hamilton has to be included in that. I know we talked about his qualifying pace, but also I think his racecraft nowadays isn't quite what it was. He's probably less aggressive, he's a bit more conservative, and does have pros when you have the best car, because you can take less risks and get out over the line. But when you have to make moves, or if he is a little bit low in qualifying, I do think he is a little bit conservative, to be honest. I think he's just been used to racing at the front of the Mercedes. So for me, I think that's the big question mark around Hamilton, and obviously his qualifying form. Even if we take away 2024, 2022 and 2023, I would say his race pace, again, was really outstanding. His qualifying was more hit and miss. But I think it's the inconsistencies which I don't think Verstappen has. So I think that's probably the main concern I have with Hamilton. But it is Lewis Hamilton, so I don't want to be, in 6 months, looking like a fool. So we'll have to wait and see.
We'll let you know if we can pull that clip up then.
It's interesting though with the Verstappen comment, because we do see him. I do believe he is sort of the complete package in that sense, and he's so consistent. And obviously last season he was dragging that Red Bull at times that was sometimes the fourth or fifth or even sixth quickest car on some occasions, and we saw where Sergio Perez was on those weekends, and Max was still able to drag that car to the high end of the points on the podium, second place, and he was always maximising the potential of that. And I think that is probably Max's biggest strength, is that he's just super consistent and always on it. Although it is interesting that we talk about racecraft and stuff, because I think that's possibly the one area of Verstappen's weakness. So only when it comes into those sort of head-to-head battles we saw a couple of collisions with Lando Norris last season. We obviously know in the past with his big crashes with Hamilton during their 2021 title fight. I think that's perhaps potentially Verstappen's only weakness. It seems to be particularly with Hamilton. There's a bit of a magnet there. They always seem to end up on the same piece of tarmac and often hitting each other.
I would say on Verstappen though, I think it is sort of the last resort. I think in 2021 the Mercedes was simply the faster car, and in Saudi Arabia he had no chance of winning unless he was driving like that. It was the same in Brazil. So I think you can say it's a criticism to some degree. I think if he gets close to a race ban, fair enough. It should be criticised. But I do think
he is fairly close.
If he actually gets one. But I think in Mexico it paid off. I think he is very calculated, and he does lose his head sometimes, but I think it's such a minor thing where I feel like a lot of the drivers do lose their heads, or it does happen. So I don't think it's fair to criticise them. I'm seeing the drivers, but like Lewis can be aggressive, Senna, Schumacher. I just think it's a trait where all these drivers are prepared to step over the line. And I think Verstappen deserves credit for it because he is clearly the top dog in Formula One, and he's shown time and time and again people are scared by him. Like they are. Yeah. That's the reality. Norris, even Hamilton is cautious against him. So
he knows how to work it in his favour, and that's where he takes advantage of it and is so successful as a result. And like we say, drivers are kind of scared to overtake him to a certain extent because you can't overtake Max Verstappen around the outside because he will just cleverly ease you off the track. Sometimes he does lose his head a little bit, but he knows how to approach those racing dynamics, and the only way you can really overtake Verstappen is to send it down the inside, but then that also could result in a collision because he'll probably just close the door as he's entitled to do. So yeah, it's an interesting debate, but we'll see how this season. I do think unless Red Bull really have managed to find something over the winter, I do think we're going to see that tested more this year because we should get at least three. I'm still not convinced by Mercedes, but we should still get at least 3 teams, potentially 4 teams fight out. And if we've got that level playing field from the start of the season where Verstappen hasn't had that, last season Red Bull were dominant and he won the first 7 of the first 10 races and he was able to build up that buffer. If we're in a situation where it's multiple teams winning races and stuff from the off, that will be a bigger test for him. And yeah, arguably a bigger test than what happened in 2021, where it was a two team and really 2 driver fight. We could end up with 3, potentially 4 teams in the mix and several drivers. It'll be fascinating to see how that all unfolds.
Yeah, for sure. I think particularly there, I'm reminded of, you guys talking about Racecraft, right? When we would get in 2021, the kind of classic like 1-stopper v 2-stopper strategies where we would see one of them would go long on the tyre, the other one would box, and then I think Spain particularly was like a great example of that, or I think in maybe Hungary as well. Or no, sorry, not Hungary. That was when the rain came down. But in Barcelona, where Lewis was kind of ticking those laps off. But as you say, that's much easier to do and much easier to calculate for the strategy teams when you've only got one car that you're already tracking. You guys spoke there about Verstappen's weaknesses. If there are, so as kind of marginal as they are, one of them can be that temper and his ability to kind of cost himself points and kind of bring the Red Bull team into a lot of unnecessary attention and criticism and give us lovely things to write about in our articles. One of the other significant talking points that we've got heading into this year are the rules about the criticism of the FIA, about swearing in press conferences, about misconduct as they define it, which is something that normally F1 fans like to be split on any issue. There'll be people saying one thing and people saying the other thing depending on who they support. But it seems like on this we have a reasonably unified voice from fans and pundits and drivers all saying that this is a bit of a step too far in controlling the media rather than allowing the sort of truth of what's going on and what people really feel to get out. I'm interested in what you guys think about those developments and particularly how it might affect the year in the sort of press. Did you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't really get it, to be honest. I think the whole thing doesn't really make a lot of sense. Like, people are swearing in press conferences, but who watches the press conferences? It's us, like journalists.
Yeah.
When it comes to like radio messages on TV, who decides to broadcast them? It sounds like the people in charge. So like, if you don't want swearing on TV, like don't put the messages out. So I think it's just nonsensical, to be honest. It's a little bit embarrassing for the sport and the FIA, unfortunately. And yeah, I think treat them like adults. Yes, they are role models. And if you are directing hate towards the stewards and things like that, bringing the sport into disrepute, I do understand there needs to be some sort of sanctions or punishment, or let's say some sort of warning. If someone says like the F word in an FIA press conference, like, you need to get a grip a little, to be honest. So I think it's a bit of a shame, and it's a shame that this is a talking point, but hopefully the focus can be on the on-track stuff when it kicks off.
Yeah, I agree with that at the final point, certainly. Like my thing is always, I just want to focus on the on-track action, and this is, again, it feels like a big palaver, a bit of much ado about nothing at the end of the day. I do, it's a difficult one. I do get the sense of wanting, there's an element of needing to be good role models and all that. And I think certainly in press conferences and stuff, there's no need to swear. But again, I take Connor's point that these aren't necessarily broadcast for everyone to see. I mean, they are on Sky. Fans do watch them, but they'll get edited out at this point. It's just, I don't think there's a need to swear in press conferences, but it's a different ball game when you're talking about swearing in the car in the heat of the moment, when these guys are driving 200 miles an hour, racing each other wheel to wheel, risking their lives, certainly risking injury. I don't think you can, it's a difficult one. I don't think you can say that they shouldn't be swearing. And as Connor said, that is down to ultimately the feed in terms of what they choose to, the broadcast feed in terms of what they choose to broadcast and put out there. And obviously they're always going to go for the more entertaining, spicier radio messages to make it seem, especially since like with Drive to Survive coming in and stuff, there's been an element of this sort of F1 becoming a little bit more showy than being the pure sort of sport. But I think, bottom line, I do think there's been made into such a big deal. I don't see anybody getting bans or really getting anywhere near to these sort of punishments that have been brought in, because they're just not going to, the drivers aren't going to be stupid enough to do that. We might get, I'm sure Verstappen will take the mick a little bit early on, and we might get the odd sort of comment out of, sort of jokey comment from him. Maybe he'll copper the first fine, but I don't think we're going to be talking about drivers getting banned or points deductions for swearing come later in the season. I just don't think it's going to be a big issue. It's a tricky one. You can't really compare it to, I mean, the comparison always gets made to football. If you put mics on footballers, they're going to be swearing and giving referees God knows what kind of abuse and stuff, but it's a completely different sport, obviously, and I don't think you can compare. If anything, footballers shouldn't be swearing more than F1 drivers when you compare that an F1 driver's driving a car at 200 miles an hour, potentially crashing into somebody or having an accident or something. It's a completely different thing. And Martin Brundle also made the point, didn't he, of how rugby players in particular are far more respectful of the referees. But obviously we have the referees mic'd up in rugby. So again, it's... it's one to debate, isn't it? But I think ultimately, I hope anyway it doesn't become a big topic, because it's just, it makes good headlines and stuff, and that on one hand is good for us lot covering it in the media, but really it's just nonsense, isn't it? And I'd rather be focused on hopefully a great championship fight and great racing week in, week out than whether somebody's said the F word or not.
For sure. I suppose what I had to ask it. I had it in the notes. I had to bring it up. I absolutely take your point on that. And I think it's fair enough for footballers to swear if they're playing for Southampton too, Lewis. I just wanted to get that in.
Right.
But...
Good job. It's a good job I'm not mic'd up on the weekends. But...
I suppose what I am interested in, though, you mentioned it is kind of a non-story, right, with this swearing thing, and then hopefully it'll flow out as the season progresses. But I think that there is a significant talking point in the kind of hypocrisy from the FIA, because we saw in December, and we covered it too, that there is this, seems like a sort of concentration of power and a reduction of reporting within the FIA, right, where Ben Slime's taking away his oversight committees and saying that it should be more centralised kind of power and control there, and saying that people shouldn't get to oversee what he's doing, while he's saying that he should get to oversee more of what the drivers are doing and saying directly. And we see him giving out his special medals now at podiums and giving sort of handshakes and things like that. Again, I wish it wasn't a story, but his leadership at the FIA, I think, is up for election next year, and maybe that is playing a factor in how public he's trying to be with his role in the broadcast. How do you guys just view his leadership as a figure in the sport?
Well, it's obviously been massively controversial ever since he took office. There's been several controversies sort of surrounding his tenure, but ultimately everything that he ends up saying, he usually doesn't help himself. Whatever topic he's on, he ends up offending or enraging people. We've seen, the drivers, there's been a back and forth with the drivers over several topics, including the swearing topic. And there's clearly a bit of a divide there between drivers and Mohammed Ben Sulayem, and also with the teams as well. The teams, there's just generally, it's causing a divide between the FIA and F1 and the teams and the drivers, and a lot of people don't seem to be happy with what he's enforcing and the views he has don't seem to be generally shared across the sport. And yeah, in terms of the changes that were made with the ethics and audit committees in December, in effectively what that's done is just given him greater power, and the president of the Senate, who's a big ally of his, kind of bypasses the need for external investigations and stuff, and they can have that power to hold account to ethics and any complaints and issues surrounding that. But it's just, that is a story that is no doubt going to rumble on this year in terms of his relationship with the teams and the drivers, and who knows what's going to come next.
And I wonder if, we've spoken about in the context of this talking point how important the drivers are, gone all the way through kind of Lewis's role in international media being a main talking point throughout the entire month. We know it was one of the key negotiation factors in his move away from Mercedes to Ferrari, in that he wanted to be viewed not only as a kind of employee of the company, but also as a partner and an ambassador of the brand. With all the attention that he's been getting for Ferrari effectively as a brand ambassador before he's even, stepped on the racetrack properly with them, do you think Toto Wolff and the kind of board back in Brackley and in Germany too will be thinking that they've let an extremely valuable asset slip through their fingers on a negotiating point that actually maybe Lewis was right to put his foot down and ask for that kind of role?
I imagine at the moment he's probably sort of like hiding behind a sofa or something, keeping a bit of a low profile, because I doubt that Toto's been like following this too much on social media and stuff. I'm sure he's enjoying his winter break before the season starts. Yeah, this is kind of like nightmare stuff for sort of Mercedes, isn't it? With just how well this has all gone down, all of the hype around it. And again, it just sort of underlines that sort of superstar status that Hamilton has. And even from a wider point of view, not just as an F1 driver, but as a general public figure. And we've seen with the fashion photo shoots and stuff, even at Ferrari, all that sort of side of it made headlines too. And yeah, Mercedes are losing a huge figure in that sense. Not only what he does on track, but everything that comes with Hamilton as a package away from the track as well. And I do think there'll be less attention on Mercedes this year. Naturally, a lot of the storyline last season was, okay, Mercedes weren't particularly competitive, but it was more about Hamilton's struggles, and everything was about Hamilton at Mercedes and his final season at Mercedes. And they'll obviously be interested, particularly if they are competitive and are in a race and championship winning scenario, then naturally there will be more of a focus on Mercedes. And obviously there's attention on how Kimi Antonelli gets on, how he compares against Russell, and how all that side of it goes down. But I do just think generally there'll be less focus on Mercedes this season, and that is ultimately because Hamilton has left. And the story is Hamilton and Ferrari, not Hamilton and Mercedes anymore. And if Mercedes are running around in 4th and 5th place or whatever, then they're not really going to be the story or the focus. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see whether there's any sort of element of regret there. Publicly, Toto Wolff is not going to admit that, and Mercedes aren't going to admit that. And they obviously have to a certain extent, have an eye to the future as well, because Hamilton is not going to be around forever, and they didn't want to lose out on Kimi Antonelli, who they obviously view as this superstar of the future. So yeah, difficult. But I imagine Toto's quite happy just to sort of be laying low at the moment and not really seeing too much of what's going on.
Yeah, I can't see Toto ever admitting he'd regret it, but I just felt like Hamilton's been with Mercedes his entire career. I felt like the romantic ending should have been with Mercedes. It should have been winning the 8th title with Mercedes. So I feel like if Hamilton does win that 8th title, like naturally, like inside of Toto, like from the human element, I know he's going to be happy for his good mate Hamilton, but I just feel like it should have been with Mercedes in the day. So, and as Lewis touched on, I don't think people are going to care as much about Mercedes either. Hamilton is the biggest, the most popular driver in the sport. So I do think, yeah, in time, I think Toto will live to regret it. Yeah.
It's interesting we say regret, though, with obviously that storyline, because that would have been seen as sort of the perfect ending, wouldn't it? But obviously that wasn't anything that Toto Wolff did specifically that caused that not to be the story. As we know, that was going to be the story until, yeah, other things came into play in Abu Dhabi, as we all are well documented on. But yeah, I do think there'll be perhaps some element of regret that it didn't turn out the way that it perhaps could have done. I think there'll be an element of regret there. Maybe not with the decision itself, but just that things didn't end with that sort of fairy tale finish.
Yeah, for sure. Well, speaking of fairy tale finishes, I'm conscious of time here, and I think we've covered everything we had planned for this episode. I did want to mention, just in terms of general motorsport, we had two fantastic events last weekend in the Daytona 24-hour, where we had Kevin Magnussen finishing in fourth with the BMW team and Porsche Penske taking first there in the GTP class. I was also just watching some of the broadcast in the GTD category, so the sort of GT type cars. The Ford Mustang factory team took their first ever win there at the kind of very famous event, and they were talking throughout it about how this sort of entry for the Ford team is preparing them well for their partnership with Red Bull. So it's an interesting kind of positive sign coming out of there, and a bit of money coming in, which could easily go towards that project. Also, speaking of 8-time series champions, Sebastian Ogier won the WRC Monte Carlo rally, kicking off that WRC season, and these two events sort of generally kick off the biggest pieces of international motorsport at the start of the year. So I think both, if you haven't checked out those highlights, I would give them a watch. But as we reach the end of the episode here, I'll say thank you very, very much for listening to episode 2 of our podcast this year. Thank you very much to Lewis and Connor for joining me. Make sure to subscribe if you want to hear more from us. If you're on your audio platform, Spotify or Apple Podcasts, give us a 5-star review because it really does help us out in the promotion. Make sure to, follow us on Instagram. Our fantastic social media editor, Laura, up great graphics throughout the year, and we'll have featured them throughout the episode. Head over to the site to hear more work from Lewis and Connor, and I think that is the end of my list of instructions. So thank you guys, and thank you for listening.